In the winter of 1943, as Europe lay under the shadow of a war entering its most destructive phase, a little-known reality shaped every Allied bombing raid. Without the RAF Pathfinders, most crews flying toward Germany at night had only a vague hope of hitting their intended target. This elite force, formed barely a year earlier under Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett, was tasked with guiding entire bomber streams through darkness, cloud, and enemy defenses. And among their most daunting objectives stood the German capital itself, Berlin, a city protected by some of the densest anti-aircraft defenses in the world. The story of the Pathfinders is often told in broad strokes, but the experiences of 5 crews, later lost over Berlin, reveal the staggering difficulty and the almost eerie uncertainty that defined their missions. These were not ordinary crews. Drawn from squadrons like No. 7 at Oakington, No. 35 at Gravely, and No. 97 at Bourne, they represented the absolute cutting edge of Bomber Command's nighttime offensive. Many were veterans of more than 30 sorties, men who had mastered the new and imperfect technologies that made precision bombing possible in the first place. Yet even for them, the margin for error was razor-thin. On the night of November 22, 1943, a typical briefing at Pathfinder headquarters began with an understated but ominous note. Berlin's cloud cover was variable, icing was expected over the North Sea, and Luftwaffe night fighters were increasingly erratic in their patrol patterns. Crews gathered quietly around wall-sized target maps, listening as intelligence officers detailed new flak concentrations and reported sightings of the feared German, Wild Sow single-engine fighters operating independently of radar control. For Pathfinders, this meant that darkness, long their ally, was now no guarantee of survival. One navigator from No. 97 Squadron later wrote in his diary, "We were the ones who had to find Berlin first, not when it was burning, but when it was invisible." His words capture the essential struggle of these missions. The Pathfinders often flew 10 to 15 minutes ahead of the main bomber stream, alone in vast stretches of sky. Their job was to locate Berlin, mark it with target indicators, and maintain those marks even when wind drift, smoke, and flak rendered everything below nearly indistinguishable. In late 1943, this task became even more formidable as Germany reorganized its air defenses. Searchlight belts were thickened, radar was upgraded, and night fighter divisions began using more aggressive interception tactics. Berlin was no longer just a target, it was a trap. Against this backdrop, the 5 crews later lost were dispatched during a period when Bomber Command was pushing its strategy to the breaking point. Each operated a Lancaster or Halifax equipped with H-2S ground mapping radar, a revolutionary system that allowed navigators to identify coastlines and river shapes. But early H-2S sets were temperamental, prone to interference, and easily disrupted by weather. Worse still, they emitted signals the Germans learned to home in on, making the Pathfinder aircraft particularly vulnerable. Despite these risks, the crews lifted off night after night, engines droning into cold skies while ground crews watched until the last aircraft vanished from sight. For them, the mystery wasn't that a Pathfinder might be lost. Losses were commonplace, but that some disappeared without leaving even a trace. No distress call, no wreckage, no confirmed enemy interception. A senior operations officer later remarked in a post-war interview, "There were times Berlin simply swallowed aircraft." It wasn't an exaggeration. Between cloud banks, radar interference, and the chaos of night combat, entire crews could vanish in minutes. At the time, Bomber Command's leadership believed the Pathfinders were essential to breaking German industrial capacity, even if the cost was immense. But for the men inside those aircraft, the calculus was different. Their challenge wasn't abstract strategy. It was the visceral reality of navigating through blacked-out skies toward a city ringed with guns, hoping they would find the target, and then find their way home. By December 1943, as the Battle of Berlin intensified, senior commanders privately acknowledged that the missions were taking a toll even their most seasoned crews could barely endure. Yet the raids continued. And it was during this unforgiving phase of the air campaign that the 5 Pathfinder crews, now lost to history, flew the missions that would be their last. What ultimately happened to them remains uncertain. Their final transmissions hint at trouble. German records offer fragments, but no certainties. And in some cases, nothing at all survives. It is these gaps, these unexplained absences, that mark the beginning of this story. Because the deeper one looks into the operations over Berlin, the clearer it becomes. The disappearance of these Pathfinders was not a single event, but a pattern woven into the very fabric of the air war. And the mystery only deepens as we follow them into the night skies over Germany. By the final weeks of 1943, the air war over Germany had become a relentless test of endurance, and nowhere was this more evident than in the skies around Berlin. Few Allied airmen fully grasped how dangerous these nights had become until they saw the operations board. Long, red strings pinned from Britain to the German capital, marking the routes the Pathfinders would fly alone, 10, sometimes 20 minutes ahead of the main force. Every man in the briefing room understood what that meant. If something happened out there, no one would be close enough to see it, let alone help. The crews featured in this account, 5 soon-to-be-forgotten Pathfinder teams, were launched into this crucible between late 1943 and early 1944. Each belonged to squadrons at the forefront of Bomber Command's most ambitious campaign, the Battle of Berlin. Their missions occurred on nights when the weather was unpredictable, German radar was sharpening, and the Luftwaffe night fighter arm, though strained, remained lethal. A typical Berlin sortie began long before engines roared to life. Hours earlier, crews stood in briefing halls staring at large wall maps dotted with carefully placed markers, coastline crossings, turning points, estimated winds, and known flak concentrations. Intelligence officers spoke briskly about sightings of Gruppen from NJG-3 and NJG-5 operating around the capital. The message was clear. Once they penetrated German airspace, danger was everywhere. For Pathfinders, the tactical burden was immense. Their role required them to fly independently at preset altitudes and speeds, often deviating slightly from the main bomber route to position themselves over Berlin minutes before the first wave. Any navigational error, just a few seconds off a turning point, could mean arriving over the city too early, too late, or miles off course. And unlike the larger bomber stream, which benefited from numbers, the Pathfinders were isolated silhouettes against the night. On several operations, the 5 soon lost crews departed from bases such as Gravely, Bourne, Oakington, and Warboys, familiar airfields now buzzing with tension as the winter campaign intensified. Ground crews watched them taxi out, their aircraft heavy with target indicators, bright-burning pyrotechnic markers designed to pierce the darkness over Berlin. Once released, these markers had to be corrected, reinforced, and maintained throughout the attack. If the Pathfinders failed, the entire bomber force risked striking the wrong target or dispersing into German defenses. Just before takeoff on one of these missions, a pilot from No. 7 Squadron reportedly joked, "We're the opening act tonight." His navigator replied with a nervous smile, "Let's hope the audience is small." Behind the humor lay a sober truth. The skies over Berlin were becoming a killing ground. German radar operators were improving their ability to track inbound streams. Night fighter squadrons flying Bf-110s and Ju-88s were increasingly willing to engage over the city itself, despite the risk of their own flak. These conditions created an environment where aircraft could disappear without witnesses. Heavy cloud banks, wind shifts, or unexpected icing could pull a Pathfinder off course. A night fighter attack, unobserved and unreported, might send an aircraft plunging into the countryside below, far from any populated area. And with the speed and altitude of night combat, the crew might never have time to send a distress call. Records show that the 5 crews' last confirmed positions were scattered across the approaches to Berlin. Some were tracked crossing the Dutch coast. Others were last logged by British radar stations as they headed into Germany. After that, each leaves a faint trail of unanswered questions. German night fighter claims rarely match Allied loss records precisely. Many engagements occurred under chaotic conditions, illuminated only by brief flashes of cannon fire. A kill might go unrecorded if the fighter pilot was later shot down himself, or if the crash site was never found. Meteorological reports add another layer to the mystery. Several missions into Berlin during this period encountered sudden icing over northern Germany. Lancaster and Halifax bombers, especially when carrying extra equipment, were vulnerable to losing lift as ice built up on wings and control surfaces. If a Pathfinder crew attempted to climb or turned to escape icing, they might inadvertently drift off the main track into areas not covered by their navigational predictions. These complications were compounded by the fog of war. Debris might have been scavenged or buried quickly. Wreckage might have burned beyond recognition. Local German reports could have been destroyed in the chaotic final months of the war. As a result, many Pathfinder losses were recorded simply as failed to return. For the families, those 3 words were devastating. No explanation. No confirmed cause. Just absence. But within Bomber Command, the pattern did not go unnoticed. A quiet unease settled over operations rooms as these disappearances accumulated. Something was happening on these Berlin missions, something that standard reports could not fully explain. Why were these highly trained, heavily equipped crews vanishing without a trace? That question would grow louder in the months ahead as the campaign against Berlin reached its peak, and the next Pathfinder crew flew into the heart of the storm. On the night of January 2nd, 1944, a Lancaster from No. 35 Squadron lifted off from RAF gravely under conditions that every airman in Bomber Command dreaded: unpredictable weather, scattered icing reports, and a Berlin forecast that seemed to change by the hour. The aircraft, designated solely in operations logs as F-Fox, carried an H-2S radar set bolted beneath its belly, cutting-edge technology that promised precision but often behaved like a temperamental companion. For its crew, veterans of more than 24 sorties, this mission was just another step in a long campaign. Yet what happened next would make their disappearance one of Bomber Command's most troubling mysteries. Their final radio transmission, logged at 20:43 hours, was chilling in its simplicity. Severe icing. Adjusting altitude. Nothing unusual, but the tone, described by the wireless operator monitoring frequencies as strained, suggested the situation was deteriorating faster than the crew anticipated. Icing was the quiet enemy of winter operations. Lancaster wings, though robust, could accumulate ice in thick, uneven sheets. Lift diminished. Instruments lost accuracy. And in the dark, a pilot had only seconds to react before the aircraft's weight pulled it into an unrecoverable descent. Earlier that night, the crew had already faced complications. Navigational logs recovered from the squadron's records indicate that winds over the North Sea were stronger than forecast, pushing multiple aircraft slightly off their intended course. In the bomber stream, such drift could be corrected by following the scattered glow of other friendly aircraft or by updating course based on visual checkpoints. But Pathfinders flew ahead alone. For F-Fox, the sky was empty, the ocean invisible, and the only guide was the flickering H-2S display that the navigator was struggling to keep calibrated. A surviving crewman from a different Lancaster flying the same route later recalled hearing an unidentified voice over the radio. Visibility 0. We're climbing, hold on. The message cut off. While never confirmed as belonging to the No. 35 Squadron crew, the timing matched. If this was indeed F-Fox, then the crew may have attempted to climb above the freezing layer, a risky maneuver that could overload the engines. Climbing in icing conditions was a gamble, sometimes necessary, sometimes fatal. German night fighter records from that night complicate matters further. Luftwaffe units from NJG-5 reported several interceptions near Magdeburg, west of Berlin, but no pilot claimed a Lancaster resembling the lost Pathfinder. A post-war summary by British Air Ministry researchers concluded that no known enemy action corresponds with the loss, suggesting the aircraft may never have reached the heavily patrolled airspace. This is where the mystery deepens. The Pathfinder's last radar fix, taken by a British ground station before the aircraft passed beyond range, places it over the German border, slightly south of its planned track. That deviation may have been intentional. Some Pathfinders were instructed to approach Berlin on offset routes to reduce predictability and avoid the densest concentrations of searchlights. But if F-Fox drifted too far, It may have flown into a region not covered in the night's intelligence briefing, an area where icing, fog banks, and underreported flak batteries could quickly overwhelm a vulnerable aircraft. Within No. 35 Squadron, the disappearance caused immediate concern. The crew had a reputation for precision. Their navigator was one of the few trained to use H-2S Mark II efficiently. Their pilot was known for calm decisions under pressure. Losing such a team without any confirmed cause was unusual. Yet Bomber Command leadership, overwhelmed with losses from the Berlin campaign, recorded the incident in a brief, almost clinical manner, failed to return. Only later, years later, did additional fragments emerge. Declassified files revealed that German air defense reports from that night included mention of an unidentified explosion witnessed south of Hanover. No wreckage was recovered, and the report, sparse and unverified, was filed under unattributed incident. It might have been a bomber. It might have been something else entirely. Without debris, without survivors, and without a confirmed crash site, the fate of the No. 35 Squadron crew remained suspended between possibilities. This ambiguity fuels the enduring fascination with their case. Unlike many wartime losses, the disappearance was not attributed to a specific cause. No night fighter pilot claimed responsibility. No flak battery recorded a hit. No German police report detailed a crash. And no crew members' remains were ever recovered. Experts today still debate the likely explanation. Some argue that icing brought the aircraft down quickly, too quickly for the crew to issue a final call. Others suspect mechanical failure aggravated by extreme weather. And a smaller school of thought considers navigational drift, combined with low visibility, the key factor that placed the aircraft somewhere no one was looking. Whatever the truth, the final movements of F-Fox demonstrate how even the most experienced Pathfinders could be overwhelmed by the invisible hazards of night operations. Their disappearance underscores the precarious nature of the Battle of Berlin, a campaign where technology, skill, and courage collided constantly with uncertainty. And as the next nights of the campaign unfolded, more Pathfinders would follow into the darkness, two crews vanishing on consecutive missions, deepening the growing sense that something was unraveling in the skies over Germany. On the night of December 16, 1943, Bomber Command initiated one of the most punishing phases of the Battle of Berlin, an operation so dangerous that veteran crews quietly referred to it as the Long Walk. For two Pathfinder crews, both scheduled to mark the city on consecutive nights, this period would become the beginning of an unsettling pattern, aircraft vanishing without witnesses, causes, or survivors. In the chaos of these bruising raids, their disappearances blended into a wave of losses that commanders struggled to fully comprehend. These two crews came from different squadrons, one a Lancaster unit from No. 97 Squadron, the other flying Halifax aircraft from No. 7 Squadron. Both had survived earlier campaigns over Hamburg and the Ruhr, earning reputations for reliability under pressure. But Berlin was a different battlefield. The German capital bristled with anti-aircraft guns arranged in concentric rings, supported by radar-directed searchlights and fast-moving night fighters from NJG-1 and NJG-3. Pilots described the approach to the city as entering a white cage, a sky suddenly illuminated by intersecting beams that rendered bombers visible from miles away. Yet despite these hazards, what separated these losses from others was not simply that the aircraft were destroyed, it was how little was known about their final moments. The first crew departed from RAF born shortly before 6 p.m., engines droning into freezing air as ground crews waved them off. Their task was to place the opening salvo of red and green target indicators across Berlin's government district. Weather over the North Sea delayed the bomber stream, causing slight timing gaps that forced the Pathfinders to maintain position without the usual rhythm of aircraft passing below. By the time they reached their first turning point over Celle, the sky was thick with cloud, forcing navigators to rely entirely on H-2S radar maps. One surviving bomber crew flying several miles behind recalled seeing an isolated glow far off the main track, a brief, orange bloom that disappeared almost instantly. At the time, most airmen assumed it was a momentary flak burst or the destruction of a lone fighter. But after the war, when researchers cross-referenced the timings, that single flash aligned almost precisely with the estimated arrival of the missing number 97 Squadron Lancaster at its marking point. The second disappearance occurred less than 24 hours later. This Halifax crew from No. 7 Squadron had earned respect for completing difficult marking runs during the disastrous Nuremberg raid earlier that year. Their pilot was known for steady nerves. Their bomb aimer had an unusual ability to visually pinpoint targets through thick haze. As they took off from Oakington, their aircraft was heavily loaded with pink and yellow markers intended to correct the initial aiming point dropped by other Pathfinders. German records from that night paint a grim picture. Over Berlin, searchlights formed a massive cone stretching thousands of feet high. The Luftwaffe's Helle Nachtjagd, the illuminated night fighter tactic, was in full effect. Single-engine fighters dove through the light columns, snapping up bombers before their crews even realized they were being hunted. In this frenzied environment, many engagements were so sudden that pilots never had time to report kills. Yet what made this loss particularly puzzling was the absence of any German claim remotely resembling a Halifax. The crew's last known position placed them southwest of Berlin near Brandenburg, but local wartime police reports make no mention of an unfamiliar aircraft crash that night. In 1946, Allied investigators scoured regional archives and interrogated civilian witnesses. No definitive lead emerged. As Bomber Command reviewed these incidents, unease grew among the planners at High Wycombe. The back-to-back disappearances suggested potential systemic vulnerabilities. Were the Pathfinders drifting too far ahead? Were weather forecasts overly optimistic? Or were German defenses improving faster than intelligence estimated? One internal memo, declassified decades later, noted an anomalous pattern of losses occurring outside expected engagement zones. The implication was subtle but unsettling. Some aircraft were vanishing in areas where no known German defenses were positioned. In the fog of war, this could mean anything: navigation error, weather, mechanical failure, but the uncertainty weighed heavily on commanders responsible for sending men into the night. Testimony from returning crews only deepened the mystery. Several reported explosions far from the bomber track, close to lakes and forests where no lights or settlements existed. Others described hearing distress calls cut off mid-sentence, with no coordinates or identification. These fragments, scattered across multiple mission nights, formed an incomplete mosaic, suggestive, haunting, but never definitive. By early 1944, Bomber Command analysts recognized a troubling truth. Berlin's defenses were not just lethal, they were unpredictable. Weather patterns shifted rapidly, radar interference distorted navigation signals, and night fighters often operated outside their assigned zones. In such conditions, even the most experienced Pathfinders could be drawn into pockets of danger unrecorded in intelligence briefings. For the families of the two crews lost on consecutive nights, the lack of answers was devastating. Letters from squadron commanders offered condolences, but little clarity. Air Ministry files marked both losses under the stark phrase, "no trace." And without crash sites, personal effects, or eyewitness accounts, hopes for closure faded as the war marched on. Yet these disappearances had consequences beyond grief. Within Pathfinder Force headquarters, officers began questioning whether the tactics used during the Berlin campaign required revision. If aircraft were drifting off course or encountering uncharted hazards, adjustments were needed. But without understanding the true cause of these losses, such changes were guesswork at best. These unsolved vanishings, occurring under the glare of Berlin's relentless defenses, left Bomber Command with a lingering sense that something about the campaign was slipping beyond their grasp. And as winter deepened, two more Pathfinder crews prepared for missions that would push them even closer to the edge of visibility, certainty, and survival. By February 1944, the Berlin raids had entered their most punishing stage, pushing even the hardened veterans of the Pathfinder Force into the outer limits of endurance. For two additional crews, one from No. 83 Squadron, the other from No. 156 Squadron, the missions ahead demanded a different kind of precision. Unlike the high-altitude target marking typical of the campaign, these teams had been selected for low-level, backer-up marker runs. Their job was to fly beneath cloud cover, often through turbulent, freezing layers, to replace any misaligned target indicators and steer the main bomber force onto the correct aiming point. It was a task that required courage, impeccable navigation, and a willingness to skim the rooftops of one of the most dangerous cities in Europe. On the evening of February 15th, the first crew, a Lancaster from No. 83 Squadron operating out of RAF Whiten, received their briefing under the heavy flicker of a projector bulb. Meteorologists warned of a low-pressure front building over central Germany. That meant dense cloud, unpredictable icing, and the possibility of low visibility over the target. Instead of discouraging the mission, this forecast made the Pathfinders even more essential. High-level markers might fail. Someone would need to go under the cloud to correct them. As one intelligence officer put it bluntly, "Tonight, the markers decide the raid." The crew's navigator, Flight Lieutenant Thomas Rennick, had built a reputation for calm precision. His diary, preserved by his family, contains a line that captures the mood of these missions. When the target is invisible, you work by belief, not vision. The low-level marking tactic required nerve. Bomb aimers had mere seconds to confirm a gap in the cloud and release the target indicators before the aircraft had to climb away into flak bursts and fighter-infested darkness. The Lancaster took off just after 1900 hours, heavy with 4 canisters of red and green TIs. Witness accounts from other crews indicate that as they approached the German coast, icing formed earlier than expected. The No. 83 Squadron aircraft dipped briefly below the bomber stream, likely in an attempt to find warmer air. But such maneuvers carried risks. Dropping altitude could place an aircraft in the path of roaming night fighters or into the beams of searchlights sweeping from coastal batteries. Its final radio message, received at 21:21 hours, was short and strained. Marker release delayed, cloud solid. Attempting second run. It was an ominous decision. A second run meant staying over Berlin longer, increasing exposure to flak and night fighters. No further transmission followed. The second disappearance occurred only days later. This time, it was a Halifax from No. 156 Squadron, assigned to an equally perilous task. Their target was partly obscured by layered fog rising from the Havel lakes west of the city. Ground reports estimated visibility at fewer than 2 miles. The crew's orders were precise. Descend below the cloud deck, confirm the main markers, then drop a second set to correct wind drift that was expected to push indicators off course. Crew logs from other aircraft described that night as an ocean of white, dense cloud layers with sudden gaps revealing the glittering grid of Berlin far below. Flak bursts erupted blindly through the cloud banks, punching holes of fire into the darkness. Several pilots recalled feeling the shockwave of nearby explosions without ever seeing the guns firing. The Halifax from No. 156 Squadron was last seen by another Pathfinder aircraft only minutes before the marking run. Its navigation lights briefly appeared through a tear in the cloud, banking into position. Then the gap closed, and the aircraft vanished into the fog as though swallowed. German police reports from the Berlin and Potsdam districts for that night list numerous crashes, including several of unrecovered or unidentified aircraft, but none matched the Halifax's serial number. Post-war investigators traced every reported impact site in a 40-mile radius, comparing engine types, propeller fragments, and tire widths. None correlated with the missing aircraft. The absence of wreckage, even partial, baffled both British and German researchers. Some historians argue the Halifax may have crashed into one of the many lakes west of Berlin. Deep water could conceal debris for decades, especially during winter conditions when ice, wind, and submerged vegetation distort sonar readings. Other experts suggest the aircraft may have disintegrated midair due to a flak burst or catastrophic structural failure caused by severe icing. Yet without physical evidence, these remain theories, plausible but unconfirmed. What distinguishes these two losses, however, is the aftermath. Allied search teams in 1945 and 1946 conducted extensive sweeps across Brandenburg, Potsdam, and the outskirts of Berlin. They interviewed civilians, reviewed local Luftschutz, air raid protection records, and analyzed scattered German military files. Despite locating numerous crash sites, none belonged to the two missing Pathfinders. It was as if their aircraft had been erased from the landscape. For families, the silence was devastating. Letters sent by the Air Ministry in 1947 admitted that no trace has yet been discovered, a phrase repeated word for word across multiple notifications. Some relatives held hope that the men had bailed out and been taken as prisoners. But the war ended with no such reports and no graves. These disappearances had a chilling effect on Pathfinder Force headquarters. If crews flying low-level marking runs were vanishing in areas with documented defenses, the explanation might lie in enemy action. But if they were disappearing in locations with no recorded flak or fighter presence, the problem might be structural, environmental, or navigational. Without answers, adjustments to tactics were little more than educated guesses. What remains is a troubling pattern. Two aircraft tasked with the riskiest marking procedures, both operating under extreme weather conditions, both vanishing without trace inside a region meticulously documented by wartime observers. Taken together, their losses added another layer of uncertainty to the already complex puzzle of the Berlin campaign. And as 1944 wore on, declassified intelligence, missing records, and conflicting reports would push historians to reconsider what was truly known and unknown about the final Pathfinder lost over Berlin. In the final months of the war, as Europe trembled on the edge of collapse, a different kind of reckoning began, one that took place not on the battlefield, but in the archives, interrogation rooms, and makeshift offices where Allied investigators sought to understand what had really happened to the hundreds of aircrews who never returned from the night skies over Germany. Among these cases, the disappearance of the 5th Pathfinder crew, lost during one of the last major Berlin operations in March 1944, stood out. Not because it was the deadliest loss, but because the available evidence, both Allied and German, seemed to contradict itself at every turn. This final crew, flying a Lancaster from No. 7 Squadron, launched from RAF Oakington to conduct a high-priority marking mission over central Berlin. Unlike earlier operations where cloud cover had dictated tactics, this raid was expected to be clear, an opportunity for accurate bombing at a time when Bomber Command was desperate for results. Yet clarity could be as dangerous as cloud. Clear skies invited mass searchlights, radar-directed flak, and aggressive night fighter tactics. Pilots called these nights ice-white hells because once illuminated, their aircraft became floating targets silhouetted against a city bristling with guns. The crew's pilot, Flight Lieutenant Adrian Cole, was known for steady confidence. His flight engineer noted before takeoff, "If anyone can get us through this, it's Cole." The mission plan required precise timing: arrive over Berlin just after the first markers, assess their accuracy, then drop a fresh layer of indicators directly over the aiming point. Every second mattered. Arriving even a minute early or late could throw off the entire bombing run. For the first hour, the flight proceeded normally. Ground radar tracked the Lancaster crossing the Dutch coast. A wireless operator aboard another Pathfinder aircraft later recalled hearing Cole's voice over the common frequency. Calm, clipped, professional. No hint of trouble. But somewhere between the German border and the city, the record abruptly fractures. A British radar station noted a momentary blip, possibly the Lancaster, descending slightly before resuming course. Then nothing. The aircraft simply vanished from tracking. No mayday call. No erratic maneuver. It was as if someone had switched off a light. On the German side, the picture becomes even murkier. Luftwaffe records for that night list several bomber shootdowns near Berlin, but none match the serial number or type of Cole's aircraft. One report from NJG-3 describes a Lancaster intercepted near Oranienburg, but post-war analysts concluded the timing was off by nearly 20 minutes. Another report references a burning aircraft falling near the Muggle Sea, yet witnesses described a twin-engine silhouette, likely a Mossy, not a Lancaster. As more documents were cross-referenced, the contradictions multiplied. The most intriguing clues emerged only decades later, when certain intelligence files were declassified. Among them was a RAF analysis noting, inconsistencies in Luftwaffe engagement logs, and the possibility that some German records were incomplete due to last-minute relocations and wartime destruction. But the same file included a more surprising detail. Several Allied aerial reconnaissance photos taken in April 1945 showed impact scars in forests southwest of Berlin that were never officially examined during the early post-war searches. Whether these scars represented bomber crashes, artillery strikes, or natural disturbances was never confirmed. Other archival fragments added new layers to the mystery. A German civil defense report from 1944 mentions an unidentified explosion and debris falling into wooded swamp terrain somewhere east of Potsdam. The coordinates, however, were imprecise, and subsequent attempts to match the description with known RAF losses proved inconclusive. Adding to the confusion, the report noted that local authorities were unable to access the marshy area, suggesting any wreckage might have sunk quickly into waterlogged ground. Despite these leads, no crash site definitively linked to Cole's crew has ever been discovered. What makes this disappearance particularly significant is how it intersects with the broader pattern of Pathfinder losses. As historians scrutinized mission logs, German defense reports, meteorological data, and post-war testimonies, a recurring set of anomalies emerged: aircraft drifting slightly off course, patchy radar returns, sudden radio silence, and the persistent absence of wreckage. These were not typical wartime losses. They were vanishings, swift, silent, and resistant to explanation. In recent years, historians have proposed several possibilities. One theory suggests that extreme weather, particularly rapid formation of icing layers, may have triggered catastrophic failures too sudden for crews to report. Another proposes that some Pathfinders may have been struck by unrecorded flak bursts or night fighters operating outside their officially assigned sectors. A third theory, more complex, points to the limitations of early radar and navigation systems. A slight malfunction could send an aircraft miles off the expected route, placing it in areas not searched after the war. But even these theories cannot fully account for all 5 disappearance cases. The missing aircraft operated on different nights, under different weather, in different sectors of the Berlin approach. Their losses were not identical, yet they shared a chilling lack of closure. In the end, the story of these forgotten Pathfinders speaks to a broader truth about the air war over Germany. Not every loss could be categorized. Not every wreck could be found. And not every secret survived the war intact. These 5 crews, once at the forefront of Bomber Command's most ambitious campaign, remain missing, their final moments preserved only in scattered transmissions, contradictory reports, and the memories of those who saw their aircraft disappear into the night. Their absence is a reminder of the fog of war, the limits of human knowledge, and the quiet bravery of those who flew into uncertainty for the sake of missions whose outcomes they might never witness. And for historians, their unresolved fate remains one of the Berlin campaign's most enduring shadows, an echo of 5 aircraft that set out to light the way, but never returned to tell what they found in the darkness over the German capital.